Welcome back to AU Family Channel, and thank you so much for being here. It truly means the world to have you as one of our loyal listeners. If our stories have ever touched your heart, we are so grateful that you keep coming back to spend this time with us. So find somewhere comfortable, take a slow, deep breath, and let us begin today's story, together. Mrs. Alsop lived in the house next to ours for as long as I could remember, a narrow brick place with a garden so neat it looked embarrassed by the state of our own, and for most of my childhood she was just furniture to me, the way old neighbors often are to kids too busy with their own small dramas to notice the quiet lives unfolding one fence over. My mum worked 2 jobs back then, cleaning offices in the early mornings and waitressing most nights, which meant my brother and I let ourselves in after school and were, for all practical purposes, raising ourselves in the gaps. Mrs. Alsop's garden was the one truly beautiful thing on our street, roses in colors I didn't have names for, a lemon tree that dropped more fruit than one old woman could ever use, and she was always out there in a wide straw hat, pulling weeds with the kind of patience that seemed, to an 8-year-old, faintly mysterious, like she had all the time in the world and had decided to spend it on dirt. She waved at us most days. We waved back. That was the entire relationship for years, 2 families living a fence apart and mostly strangers. It started properly the day I was sent over to return a mixing bowl my mom had borrowed months earlier and never quite got round to giving back, one of those small domestic debts that accumulate between neighbors without anyone minding much. Mrs. Alsop answered the door in gardening gloves, thanked me far more warmly than a mixing bowl deserved, and then, before I could excuse myself, asked if I'd like a lemonade, the real kind, made from the lemons off her own tree, and something about the offer felt too kind to refuse. I sat at her kitchen table that first afternoon while she pottered around finding biscuits, and I remember being struck by how quiet her house was compared to ours, no telly blaring, no dishes stacked in the sink, just a clock ticking somewhere and the particular smell old houses get, floor polish and lemon and something like the inside of a book. She asked about school. I gave the kind of one-word answers kids give adults they don't know, and she nodded like each one was genuinely interesting, which I now understand was its own small kindness. After that, the visits became a habit without either of us deciding they would. Most afternoons that my mum was working late, which was most afternoons, I'd find myself at Mrs. Alsop's table instead of our empty kitchen, and she always seemed to have biscuits ready as though she'd been expecting me, which she probably had. My brother came sometimes too, when he wasn't off with mates, but it was mostly me, and I never once thought to ask myself why an old woman would want a 9-year-old's company several afternoons a week, not until much later. She asked about everything, my teachers, the kids at school I liked and didn't, what I wanted to be when I grew up, and she listened in a way that made the answers feel worth giving properly instead of shrugging off. In return she told me about her garden, which flowers needed sun and which needed shade, why the lemon tree dropped fruit before it was ready some years, small useful facts I still remember decades later whenever I see a rose bush, proof of how much a person can absorb from someone who simply pays attention to them. It was probably 6 or 7 months in that I started noticing the small strange gaps, her asking me the same question twice within one visit as though the first time had never happened, or insisting it was Tuesday when I knew for a fact it was Thursday because I'd just come from PE. I didn't think much of it at the time, the way children don't really register the difference between charming eccentricity and something quietly wrong, because to a 9-year-old, old people are already a little bit strange by default, and stranger didn't necessarily mean worse. I kept visiting anyway, because the biscuits were good and the garden was beautiful and nobody at that kitchen table ever made me feel like an inconvenience, which was more than I could always say for my own house on the nights my mom came home too exhausted for much beyond dinner and bed. Looking back, I think Mrs. Alsop's afternoons were the steadiest part of my whole week, more reliable than school, more reliable, some weeks, than my own family, and I didn't have the vocabulary yet to understand what that meant about either of our lives. Then one ordinary Wednesday, halfway through a biscuit, she looked at me and said, quite naturally, as if continuing a conversation from earlier, "Michael, did you remember your jumper today?" And I sat there confused for a long moment because nobody had ever called me Michael, that wasn't my name, and I said so, gently, thinking she'd simply misspoken. Her face did something complicated then, a kind of falling, and she apologized so many times, so quickly, that I felt suddenly and inexplicably guilty for correcting her at all. The next time it happened, a few weeks later, I didn't correct her. I don't fully know why, except that I remembered how stricken she'd looked the first time, and some instinct in me, young as I was, understood that being right wasn't worth making her feel that lost again. So when she called me Michael and asked if I'd finished my maths homework, I just said yes, and watched her whole face settle back into something calm and pleased, and I decided, without telling anyone, that I would simply let it happen from then on. There was a photograph on her mantelpiece I'd walked past 100 times without really looking at, a young man in clothes that looked decades out of fashion even to me, dark-haired, laughing at something outside the frame, and it was only after the Michael afternoon started that I really stopped to study it properly. He looked nothing like me, not really, different coloring, different build, but there was something in the set of the shoulders, some ordinary quality of youngness, that I suppose was close enough for a mind starting to lose its grip on which decade it lived in. I asked my mom about Michael that night, expecting a simple answer, and instead got a long pause and a very careful expression, the one adults wear when deciding how much of something is appropriate to hand a child. She told me only that Michael was Mrs. Alsop's son, her only child, and that he had died young, a long time ago now, and that it wasn't really our business to go asking for more than that. I didn't push. But I understood, in the vague way children understand large sad things, that I had wandered into something old and painful without meaning to. Knowing that didn't stop the visits. If anything, it made me more careful with them, more willing to answer to a name that wasn't mine, because I'd started to see the shape of what those afternoons were actually doing for her, filling some particular emptiness that had been sitting in that house long before I ever knocked on the door with a borrowed mixing bowl. By the time I was 10, being called Michael most Wednesdays and Fridays had simply become part of the arrangement, the way certain families have private jokes nobody outside would understand. She taught me to cook that year, simple things, scones and a lemon slice from the fruit off her own tree, narrating the recipes as she went with little asides that sounded suspiciously like memories. "Michael always wanted more sugar than this," she'd say, or, "He used to steal the raw dough right off the bench," and I never knew exactly how much of it was truly about him and how much was simply a kind old woman entertaining a lonely kid, and eventually I stopped trying to separate the two, because both felt equally real sitting at that table. My mum knew what was happening by then, of course, and I remember overhearing her mention it once to a friend on the phone, calling it sad but harmless, saying the old woman clearly needed someone and I clearly needed somewhere to go after school, and if answering to a dead man's name for an hour a few afternoons a week made an old widow happy and kept her own kids fed and supervised, she didn't see the harm in it. Not everyone agreed. An aunt visiting once called it strange, even a bit macabre, and I remember feeling strangely protective of the whole arrangement. There were nights, lying in bed, when the strangeness of it did catch up with me, the fact that I was, in some sense, performing a dead stranger for an old woman's comfort, and I'd feel a confusing mix of guilt and tenderness that I had no idea what to do with at 10 years old. Was it dishonest, letting her believe, even for an afternoon, that her son had come back to steal scone dough off the bench again? Or was it simply the kindest thing a person could offer another person, the willingness to be whoever they most needed you to be? One afternoon she disappeared into her bedroom mid-conversation and came back holding a folded jumper, hand-knitted, dark green, slightly moth-eaten at one cuff, and pressed it into my hands insisting I try it on because I must be cold. It was practically winter. It was Michael's. I understood that without being told. I put it on anyway, feeling the strange weight of wearing a dead stranger's clothes, and she looked at me with such uncomplicated happiness that whatever discomfort I felt evaporated, replaced by something closer to honor, though I couldn't have named it that at the time. I wore that jumper home, and my mum went very quiet when she saw it, and later I heard her crying softly in the kitchen in a way that confused me, because nothing bad had happened that I could see, only an old woman giving a jumper to a boy she loved in whatever tangled way her mind now allowed her to love anyone. I kept the jumper folded in my drawer after that, wearing it only on the Wednesday and Friday afternoons, a small private ritual that I never once explained to my friends at school, sensing correctly that it wouldn't translate. By the following year the gaps in her had widened into something the whole street eventually noticed. Not just me, forgotten pots left boiling dry on the stove, the front gate left open at hours it never used to be, a growing list of small domestic accidents that made the neighbors start talking in the careful, worried tone adults use when they're deciding whether to interfere in someone else's life. My mum started popping in most mornings before work, just to check the stove was off, the door was locked, small unglamorous acts of care that nobody ever thanked her for. The scare that changed everything happened on a cold night in July, when Mrs. Alsop was found 3 streets away in her nightgown, no coat, asking a stranger walking their dog whether they'd seen her son on his way home from school, because it was getting dark and he was never usually this late. It was our neighbor 2 doors down who recognized her and walked her home, badly shaken, and I remember standing at our own front window watching them come up the path together, Mrs. Alsop still talking about Michael as though he might round the corner any moment. I went round the next afternoon as usual, half expecting the visits to be over, expecting locked doors or a family suddenly descended to take charge, but she opened the door in her gardening gloves as though nothing at all had happened, called me Michael, and asked whether I'd like lemonade. I didn't say anything about the night before. I don't think I fully understood yet how serious it had been, only that some instinct told me not to make her feel exposed or ashamed about it, the same instinct that had once stopped me correcting her name for me. It was one of the other neighbors who eventually rang the council, not out of malice but out of a fear that quietly wandering 3 streets in a nightgown was a matter of time before something far worse happened, and within a fortnight there were social workers at the house, then a daughter I'd never once seen or heard mentioned, arriving from interstate with the particular brisk efficiency of someone managing a crisis rather than visiting family. The whole street seemed to hold its breath for a while, waiting to hear what would happen to the woman with the beautiful garden. The daughter, whose name was Pam, was polite to me in the distracted way adults are polite to children who are underfoot during a family emergency, and it was Pam, standing in the kitchen one afternoon while I was mid-biscuit, who finally told me properly about Michael, that he'd been 22, that the accident had happened at a worksite years before I was born, that Mrs. Alsop's husband had died only 18 months later of what everyone politely called a broken heart, and that her mother had, in effect, been alone with that particular grief for almost 3 decades. Hearing it laid out like that, in Pam's flat matter-of-fact voice, changed something in how I understood the whole arrangement, all those Wednesday and Friday afternoons, the jumper, the name that wasn't mine. It wasn't confusion exactly, or not only confusion, it was a woman's mind finally giving her permission to have back, however briefly and imperfectly, the one thing decades of grief had never once let her put down. I was 10 years old and I had, without meaning to or fully understanding it, been standing inside someone's oldest wound for 2 years already. Pam wanted her mother moved into care immediately, somewhere staffed, somewhere safe, and I remember feeling an entirely disproportionate panic at the idea, as though the arrangement between me and Mrs. Alsop was mine to protect rather than a decision that belonged to grown adults managing an old woman's safety. I asked my mum, in the careful phrasing of a kid trying to sound more reasonable than desperate, whether there was any way Mrs. Alsop could just stay in her own house with the garden and the lemon tree, and my mum told me gently that some things aren't up to us. I went over more than usual in those weeks, sensing without being told that time was running out on that kitchen table, that garden, that particular version of things. Pam was there most days now, sorting paperwork, and Mrs. Alsop drifted between fully lost in the past and, every so often, unnervingly present, as though some part of her understood exactly what was happening even while another part had already wandered off somewhere else entirely, decades back, to a house that still had a living son in it. It was during one of those unnervingly present moments that something happened I've never fully explained to anyone since. She looked straight at me across the table, really looked, in a way she hadn't in a long time, and said my actual name, correctly, the one on my birth certificate, and told me she knew I wasn't Michael, that she'd always known really, somewhere underneath, but that it had been the kindest thing anyone had done for her in 30 years, letting her have those afternoons back. Then, just as quickly, the moment passed and she asked if I'd finished my homework. I didn't tell Pam or my mum about that lucid minute for a long time, partly because I didn't have words for it yet, and partly because it felt like something private between the two of us, proof that whatever we'd been doing at that kitchen table for 2 years hadn't been a delusion I'd merely tolerated, but something she had, in her own way, chosen and understood and been grateful for the entire time, even while calling me by a dead son's name most other afternoons of the week. The move happened on a Saturday in early spring, a small removal truck taking the essentials to a care home 20 minutes away, most of the furniture sold or given away, the garden left to whichever family bought the house next, which felt like its own small tragedy given how much of her had gone into those roses. I helped carry boxes that day, mostly kitchen things and a few boxes clearly marked, in Pam's handwriting, as Michael's, old school reports and a wristwatch and a stack of letters tied with string that nobody quite wanted to be the one to sort through. Pam caught me looking at the box marked Michael and, in an unexpected moment of generosity from a woman who'd mostly seemed too busy for sentiment, told me I could look through it if I wanted, since I'd clearly been more present in her mother's last few years than most of the family had managed to be. I sat on the floor of the nearly empty house that afternoon reading a stranger's old letters, getting to know, in fragments, the real boy whose name I'd been borrowing, and finding him, unsurprisingly, both familiar and entirely his own person. The letters were mostly ordinary, a young man writing home from a work camp about food and mates and missing his mum's cooking, nothing dramatic, which somehow made them sadder rather than less, proof of an entirely unremarkable life cut short before it had the chance to become anything more than unremarkable and good. I found myself oddly protective of him by the end of that box, this stranger I'd never met and technically impersonated for 2 years, wanting fiercely for someone, somewhere, to remember him as more than the name his grieving mother had once mistaken me for. Mrs. Alsop settled into the care home more easily than any of us expected, helped along, I think, by staff who quickly learned about Michael and simply played along the way I always had, which relieved me more than I expected it to, knowing the habit wasn't something strange I'd invented alone but a kindness other people extended too, once they understood what it cost her to be corrected. I kept visiting, every second Saturday at first with my mum driving me, later on my own once I was old enough to catch the bus there myself. The visits changed shape over the years the way most things do, biscuits swapped for whatever the home's kitchen provided, the garden replaced by a courtyard with a few sad geraniums, but the core of it stayed remarkably intact, an old woman glad of company, a boy growing slowly into a teenager who kept showing up anyway, long after it had stopped being convenient or expected of him. I brought lemon slice sometimes, made from a recipe she'd taught me years before, and told her, whenever she asked, that yes, I'd finished my homework, whatever year it happened to be. By the time I was 13 my friends had started to find the whole thing a bit odd, a teenager voluntarily visiting a demented old woman most weekends instead of doing whatever else 13-year-olds did, and I remember one particular mate asking, not unkindly, why I bothered, since she probably wouldn't even remember I'd come the following week. I didn't have a clean answer then. I think I only really understood it properly much later, that the point was never whether she'd remember, the point was that for one afternoon, someone had shown up and made her feel loved. One Saturday when I was 14, she pressed something small into my hand as I was leaving, a wristwatch, worn but still ticking, and told me it had been Michael's father's before it was Michael's, and that she wanted me to have it now, properly, as though she'd finally decided, somewhere in that fading mind, to formally hand over whatever she'd been quietly entrusting to me for years anyway. I didn't correct her that day either. I just said thank you, and wore it home, and have worn it, on and off, for every year since. The decline after that came faster than any of us were ready for, fewer good days, longer stretches where even Michael's name seemed to slip from her along with everything else, replaced by a kind of gentle confused silence that was somehow harder to sit with than the mistaken recognition had ever been. I kept visiting anyway, even when she no longer reliably knew I was there at all, because by then the habit wasn't really about being recognized, it was about a promise I'd made to myself years earlier without ever saying it out loud, that I wouldn't stop showing up. I was 16 the last time she said my borrowed name properly, clearly, in a full sentence, asking if I'd like lemonade the way she had that very first afternoon with the mixing bowl, and something in the ordinariness of the question, on what turned out to be one of her last truly present days, undid me completely in the car park afterwards in a way 2 years of steady decline somehow hadn't managed to. I sat there for a long while before I could drive home, understanding, finally, how much I had actually loved this woman who wasn't any relation to me at all. She died a few months later, quietly, in her sleep, at the age of 84, and Pam rang my mum first, before most of the extended family, because she said, and I've never forgotten this, that we deserved to know properly and not as an afterthought, given everything we'd given her mother in her last years. I remember standing in our kitchen while my mom took that call, watching her cry for a woman who wasn't family in any way the law would recognize, and understanding that grief doesn't actually care very much about what's written on a birth certificate. The funeral was small, mostly family I'd never met and a handful of neighbors, and Pam asked me, unexpectedly, if I'd say a few words, since I'd apparently known her mother, in her words, better than half the people in that room. I stood up in a borrowed tie and talked about lemon slice and rose gardens and a green jumper I still owned, and I didn't mention Michael by name once, because it never felt like my place to explain that particular arrangement to a room of strangers, only to have lived inside it as gently as I knew how. Afterwards, at the wake, an elderly cousin of Mrs. Alsop's cornered me to ask, with obvious curiosity, why a teenager she'd never heard of had been asked to speak, and I gave her the short version, the biscuits, the garden, the years of Wednesday and Friday afternoons, and left out the part about the name, partly from habit and partly because I still wasn't sure, even then, how to explain it in a way that didn't sound stranger than it had ever actually felt sitting at that kitchen table. I kept the watch. I kept the jumper too, though it no longer fits and probably never will again, folded now in the same drawer it's occupied since I was 10 years old, alongside a photocopy Pam eventually sent me of one of Michael's letters, the one about missing his mother's lemon slice, because she said I'd earned some proof of the boy behind the name, having spent 2 years quietly, uncomplainingly, being him for an old woman who needed somewhere to put 30 years of grief she'd never been allowed to finish. For a long time afterwards I found myself unusually attentive to elderly strangers in a way most of my friends weren't, noticing the ones who seemed confused in shops or bus stops, stopping to help in small ways that felt disproportionate to people who hadn't lived what I'd lived at that kitchen table. I understood something now that I couldn't have explained at 10, that a person losing their memory hasn't stopped needing to be seen, hasn't stopped deserving patience, and that correcting them is so often less about honesty than about our own discomfort with their confusion. I sometimes wonder what Michael would have made of a stranger's kid wearing his jumper, answering to his name, being handed his father's watch by a mother who never stopped missing him for a single day of the 30 years she outlived him. I like to think, from what little I gathered out of that box of letters, that he would have found it more funny than strange, the idea of some kid getting extra biscuits and a lemon slice recipe purely by accident of living next door and having, apparently, roughly the right-shaped shoulders. I drive past the old house sometimes, years later now, and the new family have pulled most of the roses out for a lawn, though the lemon tree somehow survived, still dropping more fruit than anyone properly uses, a small stubborn monument to a woman most of that street has probably forgotten entirely by now. I never stopped the car. I just slowed down for a moment, the way you do passing somewhere that used to matter enormously and now belongs, quite fairly, to somebody else's ordinary life. My own kids know the story now, in the abbreviated version children can handle, the old lady next door who sometimes thought I was somebody else, and how I let her think it because it made her happy, and how that turned out, in the end, to be one of the kindest and strangest things I've ever done. They think it's a nice story. I don't correct them either, on the parts that were harder than nice, the guilt, the grief, the 2 years of quietly not knowing if I was doing right by anyone at all. What I know for certain, all these years later, sitting here with a dead stranger's watch still occasionally on my wrist, is that Mrs. Alsop gave me something in that kitchen I didn't fully understand I needed at the time, steady attention, an adult who asked about my day and actually waited for the answer, at exactly the years my own house had too little time left over for that kind of thing. I've never quite worked out which one of us that arrangement was originally meant to save. I suspect, now, it was probably both of us, equally, and neither of us minded. Sometimes at night I think about that first Wednesday she called me Michael, the small fork in the road where I could have corrected her a second time and simply let the friendship end there, an old woman's honest mistake, nothing more. I think about how easily it could have gone that way, if I'd been a slightly different, more literal kind of child, and how much would have been lost on both sides of that fence if I had, 2 years of biscuits and lemonade and a watch I still wear, quietly, most days, without needing anyone to ask why. I think, in the end, that's the whole of what she taught me, without ever meaning to teach anything at all, sitting there in her gardening gloves offering lemonade to a kid who'd only come to return a mixing bowl. That love doesn't always arrive in the shape you expect it to, that sometimes it looks like answering to a name that isn't yours, or wearing a stranger's old jumper, or simply showing up, Wednesday after Wednesday, long after anyone would have blamed you for quietly letting it go instead. I was never her son. I want to be clear about that, even now, because it still matters to me that nobody mistake this for something it wasn't, some fantasy of secretly having been loved as a replacement child. I was only ever the boy next door with vaguely the right-shaped shoulders, who happened to knock on her door at exactly the moment she needed someone, anyone, to let her have her afternoons back. But for 2 strange, ordinary, entirely undeserved years, I got to be loved like a son anyway, and I have never once stopped being grateful for it. I still make the lemon slice most years, usually around the anniversary of her funeral, not for any occasion anyone else would recognize, just quietly, in my own kitchen, using a recipe an old woman taught a 9-year-old on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon that neither of us knew, at the time, would matter this much. My own kids ask sometimes why I always make it in winter of all seasons, and I tell them it's just a family recipe, which isn't exactly a lie, since by the end, in every way that counted, that's precisely what we were. I wear the watch on the anniversary too, and every so often on ordinary days for no reason I could properly explain to anyone who asked, some quiet private ritual of remembering a woman who is, by now, remembered by almost no one else still living. I think that's the part that stays with me most, decades on, not the strangeness of the name or the jumper or any of it, but simply the fact that somebody has to keep remembering people once the people who loved them longest are gone, and that job, unglamorous as it is, fell to me. I don't know that I ever fully resolved the question that used to keep me up at 10 years old, whether letting her call me Michael was kindness or a kind of dishonesty I was too young to properly weigh. I've come to think, now, that it was both, at once, the way most of the kindest things people do for each other usually are, some careful blend of a small untruth and a much larger, more important truth underneath it, which is simply that she needed to be loved and I was, however accidentally, in a position to provide it. The last time I visited before she died, on one of her quiet confused days near the end, she didn't call me Michael or by my own name either, she barely spoke at all, but she held my hand for a long while in the particular way you hold something you're glad has survived, and I sat there letting her, understanding that whatever this was between us by then, it had stopped needing a name a long time ago, hers or mine, and had simply become its own quiet, complete thing. I think about the mixing bowl sometimes, the whole reason any of it started, an ordinary domestic debt between two households that could just as easily have gone unreturned, or been dropped on a doorstep with a knock and a hurried retreat, the way most 9-year-olds would have preferred. Instead I stayed for lemonade. And because I stayed for lemonade, an old woman got 2 more years of loving a son she'd buried decades earlier, and I got, in return, more of exactly what I needed than I ever knew to ask for. I still think that was the better trade, for both of us.